decide who wins or loses, we'll avenge your scars and bruises. So it's on.
The Communist Party in Britain was created in 1920 by workers who faced class warfare in the factories, mines, mills and shipyards, on the railways and the docks.
They had opposed the slaughter of the Great War between the imperialist powers. Their aim was to overthrow capitalism and construct a socialist society free from exploitation and oppression.
In October 1917, the Socialist Revolution in Russia had shown what working people could do when united around a revolutionary party with a revolutionary programme. The delegates, who met at the Cannon Street Hotel in London on the 31st of July and the 1st of August 1920, likewise intended to found a political party of a new type, a party guided by Marxism, fighting on every front of the class struggle, armed with a strategy for transferring power and wealth from the capitalist minority to the working class majority.
The failure to strangle Bolshevism at its birth and to bring Russia...
Communists mobilised councils of action, which cut short Winston Churchill's military crusade to strangle at birth the young Soviet state.
From the very outset, the Communist Party demanded freedom for Britain's colonies. It joined the Communist International and called for working class and people's unity at home and across the globe against the exploiters and the warmongers. Standing on the shoulders of the Tolpuddle martyrs, the Chartists, the First International Working Men's Association and the Socialist Suffragettes, the Communist Party minted new slogans. Hands off Russia, form councils of action, hands off Ireland, organise the unemployed, soldiers, don't shoot your fellow workers. The first Labour government had no majority. Its leader, Ramsay MacDonald, threatened to prosecute Workers' Weekly editor John Campbell for calling on troops not to shoot striking workers. The government fell apart. In the election that followed, a forged letter appeared.
Everybody who connected with it, who was supposed to have received it or was supposed to have had anything to do with it, declared it and denounced it as a forgery at the time. But then, as now, the national press had a field day with it for a couple of weeks, and this undoubtedly affected the result of the election because the Labour government was defeated.
Britain's communists threw themselves into the great industrial and political battles of the 1920s. In 1925, private coal owners demanded pay cuts and longer hours.
In the run-up to the 1926 general strike, the Communist Party's leaders were charged with incitement to mutiny and imprisoned.
The Labour leaders, at the same time, had subjected the whole movement to bans and proscriptions against the communists. The government, similarly, in order to terrify the movement, arrested 12 communist leaders, whom I was one. It had no effect. The workers were not terrified.
During the strike itself and the miners' lockout which followed, thousands of CP members were arrested.
Many were locked up, including the Communist and Labour MP for Battersea North, Shapurji Saklatvala. After its surrender, the right-wing leadership of the Labour movement launched a purge of communists from the trade unions, trades councils and the Labour Party.
The communist-led National Unemployed Workers Movement, the NUWM, fought the means test, benefits cuts and evictions, sending the first hunger marches to London in the late 1920s.
Love on the dole, that's a luxury we can't afford. For they don't approve of love on the dole, on the Unemployed Assistance Board.
Communists went from Britain to India, China, South Africa and Ireland to help their peoples build trade unions and revolutionary parties.
In India, some were captured and initially convicted in the Meerut conspiracy trial. There was no jury, and they were represented in court by Nehru, the future first Prime Minister of independent India. In January 1930, the CP founded the Daily Worker newspaper, which braved police raids to report and inspire the revival of working-class militancy during the Great Depression. In the middle of a world financial crisis in 1929 to 31, the second Labour government fell apart over cuts to unemployment benefits. It was replaced by a Labour-led national government with Tories and Liberals, which proceeded to cut unemployment benefits and public sector wages, leading to destitution for millions. On the day the government was formed, its leader, Ramsay MacDonald, said, "Tomorrow, every duchess in London will want to kiss me."
The state tried to crush the NUWM and leaders such as Wal Hannington and Will Paynter, but the protests grew, forcing the national government to retreat.
There was an informer, apparently, in the National Unemployed Workers Movement, which was the organization leading the Hunger March nationally, who had told them that it was intended on the day we were presenting 1 million signatures on a petition against the means test to Parliament, that unemployed dockers and stevedores in London were coming up the river to launch an assault on the Palace of Westminster. We were going to assault it from the outside, from Parliament Square and so on.
In Manchester, young communist Benny Rothman led a mass trespass on the Kinder Scout, inspiring the formation of the Ramblers Association. Rothman was imprisoned for 6 months. When the Nazis were burning books in Germany, before they turned to burning people, communists and their allies founded the Marx Memorial Library in 1933 to mark the 50th anniversary of the death of Karl Marx.
In 1935, the mining communities of West Fife elected Red Clydeside leader Willie Gallagher as their MP.
As communism also took root in rural communities such as Leiston, known as Suffolk's Little Moscow, the party published the country standard for agricultural and food workers. The CP organised tenants to take on the slum landlords. This helped the party and its allies to mobilise huge crowds to drive the fascist black shirts out of working class communities, leading to the Battle of Cable Street, where the party was able to unite local Jewish, Catholic and other working class communities to block the path to fascism. In Spain, facing a fascist uprising and intervention by Mussolini and Hitler, communists initiated a British section of the International Brigades to resist fascism abroad. 29 relief ships filled with food collected by the Young Communist League broke through the Nazi blockade of Spanish ports. Isabel Brown established medical aid for Spain. Thora Silverthorne returned from the Aragon front to co-found Britain's first independent nurses' union.
At home, CP militants took the lead in rebuilding workplace trade unionism and organised mass rent strikes against slum landlords.
Communists were the driving force behind the hugely popular Left Book Club, the Unity Theatre and the Workers' Music Association. In 1938, the CP and allies such as Anar and Bevan launched a People's Front against fascism. They refused to trust Britain's rulers to defend democratic rights against the Nazis.
Previous to that, they talked about the unemployed not wanting to work and that there were layabouts. But when the war broke out in 1939, they were the salt of the earth, and many of them never passed the medical to get into the army because they were so suffering from malnutrition.
When the phony war ended and the Blitz began in September 1940, communists occupied the Savoy Hotel and broke into London Underground stations, leading citizens to shelter. The government finally opened the gates and many thousands of lives were saved. At its onset, the party had denounced the war as an imperialist war and convened a big people's convention for a people's peace. As a result, the Daily Worker was banned in January 1941, but clandestine presses continued to roll. In the Channel Islands, the communists led resistance to Nazi occupation, and after Dunkirk, they pressed for trade unionists to be armed to defend Britain from invasion. Nazi Germany's treacherous assault on the Soviet Union in June 1941 confirmed the war was now one of democracy and socialism against fascist barbarism.
Communists threw themselves into the war effort and campaigned for the recruitment of women workers on equal pay with men.
The CP and allies such as Bevan organised giant rallies from 1943 for opening a second front in Western Europe against the Nazis.
30,000 people jammed Trafalgar Square, London, in a speed-up-the-war demonstration. The cry is for offensive action. Giant portraits of 5 men who lead millions in the fight for freedom form a backcloth to a number of emphatic speakers. A keynote of the meeting is continued and increased aid for Russia. Consistent with our impartial policy, we present views as expressed in a recent speech in Scotland by the well-known political leader, Mr. Harry Pollitt.
Not one of us has the right to cheer when a second front is called for unless we are prepared to face all the obstacles that are at present impeding production in the shipyards, the mines and the factories.
As the Second Front became a possibility, troops began to discuss the war aims in dozens of mock parliaments. In the Cairo and Singapore Armed Forces parliaments, communist and left-wing politics won substantial support. The authorities shut the parliaments down permanently, but 80% of the armed forces later went on to vote Labour.
Communists served with distinction in the armed forces and in scientific and intelligence work to assist the anti-fascist resistance from France, Greece and Yugoslavia to the Middle East and China.
More prisoners surrender and shuffle off into captivity. Some of them wounded, some frostbitten, all of them beaten. Over Stalingrad, the red flag flies again from one of the few buildings that still stand in that ruined city.
Comrades, I have this evening accepted His Majesty's commission to form
The CP emerged from the war with increased influence in the mining, transport, electrical, engineering, construction, fire brigades and teaching unions. Mile End anti-fascist and tenants leader Phil Paratin joined Willie Gallagher in Parliament. The party welcomed the Labour government's policies for nationalisation and a welfare state, whilst urging further inroads into capitalist wealth and power.
Fearing the prestige of the Soviet Union's and Europe's communist parties, the US and British ruling classes launched the Cold War.
Nothing stands between Europe today and complete subjugation to communist tyranny but the atomic bomb in American possession.
Communists were banned or ejected from senior jobs in the BBC, the Royal Mail, the civil and diplomatic services, the police and armed forces, higher education and the arms industries. The intelligence services, big business and some trade union leaders launched a vicious purge as communists challenged the right-wing turn in the labour movement.
and for all the talk about the workers and all the sham peace propaganda, communism is today essentially a conspiracy against the liberty of the common people.
Anti-communist hysteria reached fever pitch during a series of dock strikes in 1948 and 49 and again in 1951.
Prime mover in this belated action to protect the national interests is the Prime Minister, reactionary number one, whose broadcast appeal to the nation and the dockers in particular pointed the path of duty and made clear the dangers of following advice which stems from sources hostile to this country.
The CP withstood the onslaught and opposed British imperialism's brutal suppression of movements for national unity and freedom in Greece, India, Malaya, Korea and Kenya.
In Greece and Malaya, where popular movements had defeated the Nazis and Japanese imperialism, Britain turned on its allies.
The argument was the balance of payments was held up by the £600 million we got from rubber sales from Malaya, and Britain would collapse unless we had this rubber. Well, the Communist Party said not only was it unethical, immoral to continue this imperialist war, but that it was economically a load of rubbish. The fact is we were keeping a huge standing army in order to suppress the Malayans and other peoples, of course. And this was part of the British taxpayer, but the profits from the Malayan rubber companies went to the British capitalist class. There was horrific stories, but nothing really happened until one day the Daily Worker managed to get a photograph of some British paratroopers sitting surrounded by the hands they'd cut off the guerrillas, both men and women. This was published in the Daily Worker. But you've got to realise that the Labour Party was totally implicated in it. And John Stracey, who's a former left-wing leader, was the war minister at the time.
After NATO was established in 1949, 6 years before the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact, communists helped found the British Peace Assembly as an affiliate of the World Peace Council. In 1950, Picasso attended the World's Peace Congress in Sheffield, where he first drew his famous peace dove. Many foreign delegates were barred, and the Congress forced to move to Warsaw. Despite widespread campaigning, communists were unable to stop Labour's drift to the right. Labour abandoned policies which had given it a 145-seat majority in 1945 and paid an electoral price.
Communists and socialists also established the National Assembly of Women in 1952, campaigning for workplace nurseries, price controls, equal pay, family planning and peace.
Black RAF hero Billy Strachan helped found the Caribbean Labour Congress. But a colour bar prevented legendary boxer Len Johnson from fighting for a British title. Instead, he won the British Empire title and later contested 6 elections for the Communist Party in Moss Side, Manchester.
Many writers, artists, sculptors, musicians and filmmakers joined the CP. Communists pioneered the Edinburgh People's Festival, now the Edinburgh Fringe, the South Wales Miners' Eisteddfod, and in the person of Caribbean communist Claudia Jones, the Notting Hill Carnival.
In this constituency, you have the opportunity to vote Communist. In doing so, you will be remaining loyal to the true principles of Labour. We ask you to do this because ours is the only policy which can inspire and unite all working people to inflict a crushing defeat on the Tories, the party of the rich and warmongers, and prepare the way for peace, a people's democracy and socialism. Please do not forget, vote Communist.
In the 1960s and 70s, CP members and allies set up solidarity movements with the peoples of Vietnam, Chile and Cuba. Communists earned leading positions in the campaign for nuclear disarmament and the anti-apartheid movement. 40 years later, some broke their silence to reveal their dangerous clandestine work carried out in southern Africa for the African National Congress.
Britain's communists proudly publicised the economic, social and cultural achievements of the Soviet Union, but not uncritically. The CP publicly condemned the Warsaw Pact intervention in Czechoslovakia in 1968. In the battles for progress, the CP has been influential on many fronts.
The likes of Muriel Raymond and Muriel Court played an influential role in the militant campaign which won the 1970 Equal Pay Act. Communists helped shape the historic demands of the Women's Liberation Conference in Oxford.
The shop stewards representing the workers are in control of this yard. Nobody and nothing will come in, and nothing will go out without our permission.
In 1972, Upper Clyde Shipbuilders was saved after communist shop stewards led 8,500 workers in a work-in, during which 16 seagoing ships were built. The Liaison Committee for the Defence of Trade Unions, headed by Kevin Halpin, united workplace militants across Britain. They organised solidarity action to free the jailed Pentonville dockers in 1972 and killed off the repressive Industrial Relations Act.
Unanimous decision to call a strike starting midnight of the 9th, and it'll be a complete strike, total strike.
Powerful communist influence in the coalfields ensured victory over the Tory government in the national strikes of 1972 and 1974.
CP industrial organiser Bert Ramelson exposed the Labour government's social contract, or social contrict, in 1974.
In the early 1980s, as unemployment soared above 2 million, the CP initiated 2 widely supported people's marches for jobs from around Britain to London.
In 1986, Communists played a leading role in the year-long battle with Press Baron Rupert Murdoch at Wapping and Kinning Park, Glasgow.
Picket organiser and CP General Secretary Mike Hicks was jailed on trumped-up charges, enabling union leaders to sign away 5,500 jobs.
The critics of the Soviet Union and the socialist economies of Eastern Europe and so on come from the left and the right, and where they unite is on trying to portray those first experiments in building a socialist society. They always seek to portray it in negative terms, as if it were always a failure. In fact, it doesn't represent the reality at all. So I have gone back, I have studied those economies. Clearly there were problems, some of them quite fundamental problems, and were not fully resolved, hence contributing to the collapse and counter-revolution and so on. But there was also much in the experience of the Soviet Union and the Eastern European socialist countries that corresponded with what Marx thought were the essential characteristics of the communist mode of production.
The downfall of the Soviet Union was followed by Western military interventions in Yugoslavia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya and Syria. Britain's communists helped form the Stop the War coalition and played a leading part in the resurgent peace movement. They have also revived the British Peace Assembly as an affiliate of the World Peace Council. Britain has voted to leave the EU, and the party maintains its opposition to the European Union and NATO as anti-democratic, pro-big business alliances of capitalist powers which negate popular sovereignty. Alongside the RMT Union and the Indian Workers Association, GB, the party played a leading role in anti-EU electoral alliances and the Left Leave campaign in 2016. Communists have also helped establish and lead the People's Assembly against cuts in public services, pensions and social benefits. Since its re-establishment in 1988, the CP has renewed its activities on many fronts and updated its programme, Britain's Road to Socialism.
We play a full part in the international communist movement, which brings together more than 100 communist and workers' parties and national liberation movements, from Portugal to the Middle East, from Chile and Cuba to Russia and China, from Sudan and South Africa to Vietnam and Australia.
The party's goal remains socialist revolution and the construction of a sustainable society free from all forms of exploitation and oppression. On every front of the political class struggle, the Communist Party of Britain is active, united and growing. Join the CP and help achieve the socialist revolution in our lifetime.